What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of Trojan Dash. I apologize for the late start. We were experiencing some minor technical difficulties, which means, you can't have a Trojan Dash without some of those, but we are back. We are here. As always, I'm Nathan Ackerman, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Anthony Gharib. Anthony, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Nathan. What about you?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. I always look forward to Wednesdays at 6 p.m. when we can talk about some Trojan hoops. And we've got a lot to get to this week because USC played 3 games since our last show. Did they win all of them, Anthony? Tell me, did they win all those 3 games?
Of course they did. What do you
The
mean?
answer is yes. They won all those 3 games. They have won 9 of their last 10. And let's talk about the most recent of those, a 72-66 victory over Stanford at Maples Pavilion in Palo Alto. It was USC's first win on the road against Stanford in Palo Alto since 2013, almost 8 years. It was, I think, February 9th, 10th, 11th, something like that. So a historic day for the Trojans. But more importantly, they are in second place all alone in the Pac-12 standings, behind only UCLA. Anthony, tell me about the pros and the cons. What were your main takeaways from USC's victory over the Cardinal?
Yeah, well, if you look at the game script, this was pointing out to be a game where USC would end up losing. Just looking at the numbers, they allowed 52% shooting from Stanford in the field, 43% from the three. This is a game where usually they would lose, and this would happen in previous games. And obviously, the rebounding margin wasn't too large as well. USC only had 30 rebounds. Stanford only had 28. They weren't able to control the boards. They weren't able to slow them down on the perimeter. That's usually what's a recipe for disaster for the Trojans, and that's a game that they usually use, but they were able to find a way to get out of it. And I think that's the main pro. They were able to control the second half, outscored them, I think, by 11 points. And they were able to also, even though they let the bigs kind of slow down, Oscar da Silva only had 9 points. He was in foul trouble. The main con from this is actually that they allowed the guards to kind of go off, and that's Jordan Dallaire and Michael O'Connell, who had 22 and 20 themselves. I think that's the main con, but the biggest thing is really they were able to find a way to get out of it, because this is a game where, if you look at the games against Oregon State, against Colorado, they fell into droughts and they weren't able to get stops. It happened in the first half. They were able to recover and they were able to get a win in the end. I think that was the biggest con, or excuse me, the biggest pro. And also Drew Peterson. We kind of might mention it later on, but he had some really subpar games. Only had 3 points in back-to-back games. It was 1 of 6, and I think 1 of 8. He had 15 points, so that was really big. We were able to get everyone involved and kind of get more big minutes from Max Agbampolo. Those are the biggest pros, in my opinion. But it's a big win, and it's a game where you go into the March Madness, you go into the Pac-12 tournament. Some games are not going to go your way, but they fought and they found a way to win, and I think that shows something big for them.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things for me, I'm an eternal optimist, so I'm going to start out with the positives here. I think the biggest thing for me is something that I am going to be completely honest. When USC won 6 games in a row, they won 8 out of 9. I didn't always see the offensive rhythm there, and I didn't always see the offensive rhythm against Stanford either, especially in the first 10 minutes or so. But they found that, and I think they were down around 10 points with about 10 minutes left in the first half, and it seemed like the game was just kind of spiraling out of control. I mean, they made it close at one point, and then Stanford answered with a run. Stanford answered with a run, and then they were back down 10, 12, 13, something like that. So the fact that they were able to close that gap going into halftime. I'm a big momentum guy and a big how does the first half end kind of guy, because if they were down 35-32, they went on a 6-0 run to close the first half, and it just seemed at that point like, okay, they were finally starting to realize that USC is the better team. I mean, they were the better team in that game. They are probably maybe the second best team in the Pac-12. They certainly have among the most playmakers in the entire conference. And you kind of look at that game on paper and say that USC should win this game, and it seemed like that finally started to click going into halftime, and they really kind of, I guess, continued on and kind of built upon that offensive rhythm game for the second half. So that was really nice to see. One of the cons was that, like you said, this game should not have been close. Stanford was missing 3 big contributors. I think Dejon Davis, Bryce Wills, and Zaire Williams. They were all out. And when I saw that, I kind of thought like, oh, this just makes so much sense for USC to lose this game. Like, there's no reason at all why they should. It's a total trap game. And when they were down 10 in the first half, I was like, yeah, that's definitely going to happen. But they ended up finding out a way to get that done. And one of the biggest things about why they were able to close that game was something that I've seen in previous games, previous close games. I'm thinking mainly about the Oregon State game, and they didn't do it this game. They were not passive at all in the last minute and a half, 2 minutes or so of this game. The Tajidi step back was nasty. It seemed like they had the offensive rhythm going, and they sort of kept that up and sort of, just, I guess, hit the daggers and then twisted the knife, right? I'm thinking about the three-pointer that Drew Peterson had against Oregon State where he kind of passed it up. It was kind of deep, but it was kind of wide open, and you want to see him taking that shot because the guy can hit that shot. But he and Edey, I think, scored all of USC's last 6 or 8 points, something like that. And it just seemed like they were trying to do everything they can to, well, avoid losing, but also avoid going into overtime and just sort of put that game away. So that was nice to see from my perspective. But as I said, and as you said, it shouldn't have really been that close. I mean, Stanford was hitting some shots. You mentioned before the show that they were hitting all their threes, and they were getting open looks too. It wasn't like USC was, smothering them on defense and they were just hitting tough shots. They were hitting some wide open threes. So that obviously shouldn't happen, but in the end, they sort of came out of the gates slow to start the game, and they picked it up. It all kind of clicked, and I think that's why they were able to win that game.
Yeah, the second half, they just looked like they were more comfortable. They kind of had that momentum, like you said, going into halftime, where they kind of realized, we can beat this team and we should beat this team. And that's what they kind of did in the second half. I mean, they really controlled the game. They controlled the tempo, and they stopped the perimeter shots, and they just kept working on the offensive end. At the end of the day, that's what's going to win these games, when you get kind of controlled and you're able to kind of turn on a switch. I know some good teams and some great teams have that ability to have an on and off switch. They kind of replicated that last night. I'm not saying that they had that type of potential, but in the first half, it seemed like they were a little bit out of it, giving up a lot of easy shots, going into droughts. In the second half, they kind of eliminated that and really focused down on the defensive end and obviously getting better shots. And that's what ended up giving them the win. And I think that's probably the biggest pro. They were able to focus. They were able to just find a way to battle it out and grind it out in a win where the storyline was really not set up for them to win. Like you said, 3 players out, but Stanford beat UCLA a couple weeks ago with 3 players out. So anything can happen, and they were able to find a way. And I think
that's true.
Yeah, and so that's something that should be paid attention to. But so they were able to find a way, and that's really what's most important.
Yeah, and one of the other things is with this team, use free throws are going to hit them, right? They rank somewhere like 304th in the entire nation, and just like absurd 12 by a long shots. It's, to me, it isn't about like simply catching fire and hitting like 95% of your kind of just accept. They seem to go pro, and then not yet, but impress. He's been a stud all season, and he's really picked it up in his last 3 games or so. I think he's had 2 of his highest scoring 3 games. His 2 highest scoring games come in the last 3 games that USC has played so far. So he just continues to flourish. Let's talk a little bit about the Mobley brothers, because we talked about how good Evan's been. Isaiah has been somewhat pedestrian as of late. I think 7, 6, 7, 6, 7, 9, 7, or 7, 9, 7, 6, 7 in his last 5 games, something like that. Obviously not the kind of numbers we're used to seeing from him. I thought he's really taken a step forward this year, but it seems like he's kind of slowed down in the last few games. Tell me about, A, whether you think this is Evan Mobley's peak, like can he get even better from here, and B, what's your level of concern about Isaiah Mobley?
I think Evan's peak, we probably still haven't seen it yet, because he's still not a consistent jump shooter, and I think that's the next step. If he extends his game to the 3-point line, I mean, he's going to be practically unguardable, because usually what they're doing in last night against Stanford, they're just straight up doubling him immediately when he gets the ball. If he stretches the floor out, that kind of creates more opportunities for everyone else. I think that's the next step for him. I'm not too worried about worried about that. And in terms of Isaiah, definitely not worried about his play. I think he has taken a step back, but it kind of makes sense because I think when USC got back Ethan Anderson, I think his playmaking role kind of diminished. He's not really a playmaker himself, but I think his responsibilities went down, and the game has really been more focusing on Tajiri, Drew Peterson, and Evan Mobley getting involved, and usually Ethan Anderson is the one handling the ball. But one thing that, to be honest, I've noticed is that Andy Enfield usually doesn't run a lineup where it's just Isaiah Mobley and not Evan. And if he does, it's a very short amount of time, so he doesn't really have too much time to get aggressive and what's it called? Yeah, he's just not really being aggressive and just get his rhythm going. Yeah, that's the word. But that's really what it is.
Yeah.
He's just not putting shots up. And like you mentioned, it's 5 straight games where he's been in single figures. That's not a problem because they're still winning games. I mean, if they went 0-5, then yeah, that's a problem. But they're still finding ways to win games, and he's still playing his role. He's still defending at a high level. He's still rebounding the ball, and he's just doing what he needs to do in his role. And I think that's what Andy Enfield is probably asking of him. He's not getting enough shots. I think so, but he's still playing his role, and they're still winning the game. So I'm not too worried about it. I think USC is probably the most talented team in the conference. But when it comes to March Madness, some games he's not going to be playing so well, and the other players are going to step up. And some games the other players not going to play that well, and he's going to be able to step up. So I think it's a game-to-game basis. But in my opinion, I think Enfield needs to kind of give him more minutes. It's just him, Chavez Goodwin, no Evan Mobley, so we can kind of get into a rhythm and get into a flow. So when that time comes where they're doubling other players, they can look for him to get a bucket. But I'm not too worried about Isaiah right now. I think they're still in a good groove, and if we get to that stage where he needs to step up, I think he'll be ready.
Yeah, I think I come in with a similar angle as you, and that is when I was going through Isaiah's stats of the last 5 games or 5 games or so, whatever. I was expecting to see like poor shooting performances, I guess, just because I don't know, when you're one of your team's best players and you don't score many points, it's usually, because you're putting up shots but you're just not hitting them. But that isn't what I saw, and his percentages have been pretty high, and he's hitting a lot of his shots. So I think the thing about the Mobley brothers is you can't really talk about one without including the context of the other, right? And I think the fact that we're seeing Evan really take off. I mean, we know he's been a stud all season. He's probably going to be the number 1 or 2 overall pick, but he's been especially good in the last 3 or 4 or 5 games. And I think the fact that Isaiah hasn't really, I guess, stood out in the stat sheet, like from a scoring perspective, isn't really a coincidence when you think about it, because like you said, they are often on the floor at the same time, and when they're on the floor at the same time and Evan's as good as he is and Evan's playing as well as he is, especially, Evan's going to be taking most of those looks. So I think if Evan cools down, like, I don't think that's really necessarily a lock. Like, he could just go and score 25 points a game for the rest of the season. I don't think any of us would be terribly shocked. But if he does, I think you're going to start to see Isaiah's role naturally expand. So I'm also not too worried about him as well. I think you can still see, like, even if he's not scoring, 15 points per game, I think you can still see the improvement from Isaiah. It just looks like he's a lot more comfortable out there. He's a lot more coordinated. It seems like he has a feel for the game that he didn't really have as much of last year. And I think, I think he's going to continue to be a pivotal, aspect of this team on the offensive side moving forward. I would like to see him, like you said, sort of, I don't know, maybe sink or swim, like let them just see what he can do and put him on the floor at times when Evan's not in there, because I think he's, nearly as capable of a scorer. I mean, they both have similar games, and I think Isaiah's very, very talented too. I mean, Evan's, I guess in a class of his own in the conference per se, but I mean, Isaiah's right up there with him, I think. So if they really allow him to flourish in that role, I think that he will. And as far as Evan goes, I don't think this is anywhere near Evan's peak. And I think the reason why is, he's been dominating in his last few games, but I was watching the Stanford game especially, and it seems like when Evan gets the ball like around the free throw line or really outside of like a 10-foot range, it seems like he is obviously not as comfortable as when he's, right right by the hoop. Like he doesn't really have that. I mean, he can back guys down and then dunk on them or hit that little like baby sky hook with his right or his left. He's super versatile there. But it just seems like, I mean, he was called for a travel two or three times, and I think that's only going to come. I mean, as he continues to develop and he continues to get more experience in that role where he's, getting fed the ball right around the free throw line or even around the 3-point line, we've seen that he can shoot. So I think once you expand his arsenal by, making him more comfortable outside of a 10-foot or so range, I mean, the guy he can average 32 a game.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we forget is the guy's 18. I mean, we're as old as him.
Yeah.
And he still has so much time to develop. And I think that Andy Enfield, not to make you sad, Nathan, but I think that Andy Enfield mentioned is that he's getting more comfortable with the Pac-12 competition. He's figuring out the looks that he's getting, and he's just being more dominant and aggressive. There were some games I remember. I think it was maybe last month where he was having some subpar performances. Like against Utah, he had like 1 or 2 field goals. So he's getting more comfortable now and being more able to be dominant and score and assert himself. Because I think Andy Enfield also mentioned too that they asked him to be more dominant and they asked him, "Hey, you want more?" And he's been responding. So it's only a matter of time until he takes that next step. So we have to remember, I mean, he's still pretty young.
Yeah, and I mean the thing that you were saying about getting Isaiah more looks, I think is going to be super important when they get into the heart of Pac-12 competition, the Pac-12 tournament, if it happens, March Madness, if it happens, even against teams like UCLA and what's that now? 3 days from now, 4 days from now, 3 days from now, Saturday. And what you're going to see teams that nobody can really stop Evan Mobley, but you're going to have defenders that are like, I don't know, 7'10" that can like hang with him and, not allow him to just score, 25 points a game. So you're going to need to have other options there. And with Isaiah, it isn't that I'm worried that he can be that guy. It's that they just need to get him more looks. And once I think you have Evan somewhat neutralized, I mean, to the extent that you can neutralize a guy like that, I think Isaiah is just going to naturally be awesome to see. And then you're going to have both of them clicking like that, and it's going to be, this team's going to be pretty unstoppable, especially down low. But I hinted at it, and USC's competition is about to ramp up. They play definitely the biggest game of the season that they will have played so far this Saturday against UCLA. UCLA is at first place in the Pac-12 standings with 1 loss. USC has 2. No other team has 2 losses except for Oregon, but they only have 4 because they had a bunch of COVID cancellations, things like that. Point is, it's shaping up to look like it might be a 2-team race, maybe a 3-team race, but USC and UCLA are at the top of the pecking order there. So this is a huge game. It's the first of 2 against the Bruins. And, if one of those teams takes both, like they probably win the Pac-12. So giant game. A lot of stakes, and it's also gonna, I said a lot of stakes, that isn't even a saying, high stakes, and it's really gonna tell us what this USC team can do in the big moments and against the best teams. What are you watching for specifically this Saturday?
Yeah, you mentioned it's always a big game when you play that other team in LA, and this is probably the biggest one of 2 of the biggest. Obviously, the last of the game is probably the other biggest one, but I think one thing that you got to mention here against UCLA is they've got amazing guards, and I don't think USC has really dealt with a team like this. I mean, I think probably the best guard they've played was Mackenzie Wright from Colorado, and he was the only good one that they've really played, who's really gave it to them. UCLA has 4. I mean, just going off my list right here: Chris Smith, James, I hope I'm saying these names right, Tiger Campbell, Johnny Juzang, and Jamie Jacks Jr. I mean, these guys can play, and all of them average double figures. And obviously, they have 5 players, so 4 guards who average double figures. And Cody Riley, I don't know if you remember him from the LiAngelo Ball incident in China with the Louis Vuitton bags. So, I mean, they're all
get out of here.
No, I mean, it's the truth. I mean, you got to bring it up. They're all fantastic players, and they can match up with this team. What I'm really going to want to see is how will Andy Enfield counter with 4 guards in a UCLA. USC usually really runs with 1 guard, Taji, and the rest are just forwards. So how is he going to counter? Is he going to maybe insert Ethan Anderson to the lineup for Isaiah White? Is he going to stick to it and say, to hell with that, I'm just going to go big and see if they can counter with me? I think that's the option that he might go with. But that's the main thing I want to see. how is UCLA, excuse me, how is USC going to deal with these guards, especially now Nathan Anderson back and him kind of getting in more of a rhythm and flow of the season? But that's the main thing that they have to really look out for. But obviously, I really want to see what Evan Mobley does too, because Cody Riley is really the best forward that they have that can stack up with him. And this might be the game where Isaiah just goes crazy because they're going to be so focused on Evan that Isaiah might have more room to kind of be more aggressive and assert himself on the offensive end. But those guards, man, I mean, they're in trouble, and they got to find a way to stop those guys.
They are trouble, yeah. And I think it is going to end up, I mean, we know about the forwards, we know about Mobley, we know about well, the other Mobley, both of them. But I do think it's going to be a battle of the guards here. And I think Ethan Anderson's going to have a pretty big role, like even bigger than he's had in the last few games. But to me, it isn't necessarily a trade-off. Like they don't necessarily have to go small to stop some of those guards. I mean, you have some bigger USC guys that can, play pretty much any position on defense on the floor. Isaiah White, like you mentioned, kind of sticks out as one of those guys to me. Like, he can guard one of the guards, he can guard one of the forwards. He's kind of just everywhere on the floor at the same time. It feels like he can guard, 5 guys at a time. So it's all going to be about whether USC's guards and whether USC's bigger, more versatile defenders, forwards specifically, are going to be able to stop UCLA's guards. To be honest, I don't know if that's going to be able to happen. I mean, we've seen how good this team can be on the defensive side, but we haven't seen them play a team that's this talented. I guess maybe Colorado, when they were playing them, was pretty good, but like Colorado's fallen off since then, so I'm not really entirely sure what to make of that team. But to me, the other thing that this game's gonna signify from a bigger picture, I guess, from a less X's and O's standpoint, I guess, is whether this team can win in the big moments, because that's a thing that USC, well, okay, we just came off of the football season, and we know that the football team wasn't able to do that in the big moments. But with the basketball team, surprisingly, last year, they were actually able to win some big games down the stretch. They beat Arizona and Arizona State, who were both two good teams, at home in the final week. And then the last game of the season against UCLA, there was a ton at stake there. They had, a chance to play into a first-round bye in the Pac-12 tournament. That never happened. They had a chance to, I guess, assert themselves as UCLA was at the top of the Pac-12 standings, but they had a chance to make a statement there, and they did. But the thing about that team is that it's a lot different from this team. I mean, Jonah Matthews hit that step back 3 to win it. He's gone. Onyeka Okongwu is gone. So this is pretty much a team of a bunch of freshmen, a bunch of sophomores, and then a bunch of redshirt junior, senior grad transfers. So whether this team still has the same makeup, obviously they're still led by the same guy, is going to be interesting. And I think it's going to be something that obviously is going to have implications whether or not this team can go deep in the Pac-12 tournament and deep in March Madness too.
Yeah, in terms of the big moments, I think they really haven't had any big type of games. Maybe in the early season when they played UConn and they kind of stunk it up at the end. But I think one game that's kind of underrated that they played was at home against Oregon State. Because think about it, you lose twice to Oregon State in the season, and that's not going to look too good on your resume. So that was a big game. But I mean, you're right. Players, they don't have that type of experience yet, and it's a big moment to see how they'll step up because they haven't played those top-tier Pac-12 teams. Colorado has really fallen off. They just played Stanford, but they were without 3 of their starters. They haven't played Oregon. So UCLA, this is really the first big test for them. And another thing to mention, you talked about the defense. Recently, their defense has been great, and they've been allowing the field goal percentages for the opposing team has been pretty high compared to what they started with. I mean, what they started with was pretty impressive, so it kind of makes sense that it'll drop off. But in a game like this, they really need to pick that part of the game up. And of course, the rebounding margin is going to be important. The smaller team in UCLA, I think I was reading the other day that UCLA actually might counter with a bigger lineup. So we'll see how that goes. But I think in terms of USC, they got to prove if they can really play. And I want to see what Drew Peterson will do. I want to see if Tajiri can step up. And Isaiah White is honestly going to be extremely important in terms of his defensive energy. and what he can bring on that side, and obviously, hopefully, something on the offensive side. But main thing I see, can they step up in the big moment when it counts? Like you said, this has big implications on the 12 tournament and, of course, on March Madness if those do happen.
Yeah, I want to talk again about whether, USC goes big, goes small, whatever. If I'm Andy Enfield in this game, what I'm thinking is, yes, UCLA has a ton of talented guards that can beat pretty much anybody. But what is really the backbone of this USC team? It's defense, right? It's length, it's defense, it's being able to stop guys down low, and it's having those versatile defenders like Isaiah White that can, are bigger, are forwards, but can also defend against the guards. And if I'm Andy Enfield in this game, I'm saying I'm going to stick to what my team does well. And as soon as they decide to make this UCLA's game and just have UCLA dictate the tempo, dictate the rhythm, dictate the size, everything like that, they're all thrown out of sorts. And I think this one could get out of hand kind of fast. So if I'm Enfield, I'm trusting the defense that I have. Talented guards this year, obviously not as talented and not as deep as the ones they're going to face on Saturday, but it's shown that it can do that. And I think they should really think, obviously Anderson's going to have to play a big role, because I think, guard, forward, whatever, he's just one of their best players. So I think they need to have him on the floor a bunch, but I'm not getting too caught up in like going super small in this game, because I think it's just not what this team does best.
Yeah, I for sure agree. I think Enfield should be stubborn. He should just say, I'm going to see what you guys can do, because they got to play that game. If USC goes small, it'll be difficult for them to compete. And that means either you're running Evan Mobley at the 5, or you're running Isaiah Mobley at the 5, or if you want to throw in Chavez Goodwin, it'll be a mess. And I think they should just stick to what they know and just play big, because that's the only way that they can win this game. Because if they play the UCLA style, it's going to be a long, long night. And we're going to be talking about it 2 weeks from now, about how they should have won the game. So hopefully they just stay to their script, and maybe it'll be a big game and a big win for them.
Before we wrap up, real quick, give me a winner and a score. I've got USC 73-71.
Jeez, putting me on the spot. You know what I say? I say USC. I might say a little bit higher. I'll say 75-73. A little bit, just 2 points higher than yours.
I like that. We're thinking along similar lines, because great minds do think alike. That is going to do it for these two great minds on this edition of Trojan Dash. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. As a reminder, follow us on all of our various platforms. You can check out all of our content at dashsports.tv. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. You can catch all of our content there. Anthony is doing a column with Sports Pac-12. We have a bunch of our fellow Dash Sports writers doing columns over there, so please make sure to check them out. And of course, don't forget to tune in 2 weeks to the next edition of Trojan Dash. Anthony, thank you as always for joining the show today. We will talk to you next time.
Thank you, Nathan.